Well, thank you for coming after that long lunch. I know that everybody would probably love to go out and take a walk after that high carb lunch, but thanks for coming. Just let me know. We're good? Okay. Talk over what? Okay, I'm going to just introduce everybody really quick. I'm going to just introduce our panel today. This session, we organized this session around student health and wellness. As we all know, there's a mental health crisis among our college students. And if you're in academia and you've taught or are teaching, you, I'm sure, have experienced this. We have a nice cross-disciplinary panel today. And we're going to hear from Dr. Heidi Zinzow. She is a professor in psychology and a licensed clinical psychologist. So she's going to talk first, set the context for us. And then second, we're going to have Sally and Matt. Sally is a associate professor in the School of Architecture, and she is the director of undergraduate studies in architecture. And then Matt brings the landscape architecture perspective to the table. He's the director of landscape architecture, and they both teach first year undergrad together. And so they're going to share their perspective with everybody. And then third, we have a real pleasure of hearing from the students, our two superstar students. Nothing against the other students, of course, but they're the M.Arch students who teach research design, who are in my research design and methods class, and they'll be sharing with you our findings from our research this last semester. Okay, and then we also have, so this is Kat and this is Michael. They're also, I would say, not emerging leaders, because I feel like they're already leaders in lots of different student organizations, and so that's our future here. And then on the end here, we have Julia and Luke, and they represent the undergraduate perspective at Clemson University. So we have a really nice wide set of perspectives here. With that, I'm going to start with Heidi, and she's going to set our context.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm again Heidi Zinzow. I'm involved in a lot of the wellness programs on campus, as well as being a psychology professor, and thank you for the introduction. So I'm just going to give some background on student mental health and prevention and wellness initiatives and some of the interventions that we utilize. So first, I'm going to start off to talk about what is the prevalence and the status of mental health among college students. And we know that college students suffer high rates of mental health problems, including mood and anxiety disorders being some of the top psychological disorders among students. And about 1 in 5 meet criteria for a psychiatric or psychological disorder. And a recent study has actually found that 91% report moderate to high stress. And we think about stress as being a physical, a mental, emotional strain or tension, often when somebody has demands in their environment that exceed their ability to cope with them. And then about 39%, over a third, experience anxiety, which is often characterized by worries and tension and physical problems. And over half report some symptoms of depression, which is characterized by feelings of sadness, loss of interest in activities and pleasant events, and loss of interest. So sometimes self-worth issues and hopelessness as well, you can see along with that. And another alarming statistic among college students is this age group is at risk for suicide. So that is the second leading cause of death among college students. So we actually have implemented a suicide prevention initiative at Clemson fairly recently, that helps address these problems among the other types of health promotion initiatives that we have. So we all know that the coronavirus pandemic has negatively impacted students as well, and anybody that's working with students probably sees some of these effects. Over 80% report that COVID negatively impacted their mental health. We see them having externalized personalizing symptoms, attention problems, struggles academically, and some of the stressors that they experienced during COVID included financial strain, relocation, transitions in academic modalities, and reduced access to services. So that is a very large number of our students who are maybe in a worse state in terms of their mental health status post-COVID that we now need to address as a university community. And just looking overall at US national prevalence of psychological disorders, just real quickly to show you that when we're working with college students, we're working with a high risk age group in terms of mental health. This graph shows you the prevalence of any mental illness among US adults in 2020. And you can see that the age 18 to 25 age group shows the highest prevalence of all adults with about 30.6% meeting criteria for mental illness. And you can see that it's hard to read at the end there, but two are those who identify as two or more racial ethnic groups are the highest risk group in terms of looking at our demographics. And we also want to think about who's accessing mental health services. Are people getting the treatment that they need? We can see that young adults, 18 to 25, are those with mental illness they're actually less likely to access mental health resources. So we need to do some work in terms of making sure that those who need treatment are receiving it. And that's in comparison to the older age groups. And we can see that our white young adults or white demographic groups are most likely to access services. So our minority groups are less likely to access services for a variety of reasons and barriers that they face that we need to address as well if we want to help these populations. So next, I'll quickly go over some of the common risk factors that we observe among college students. And it's important to understand these because it helps us to identify the students who are potentially in need, and especially identify them early before maybe they develop a mental health problem, because if we can identify those at risk, we can be more likely to prevent more severe problems from occurring. And risk factors just mean that they're factors that increase the likelihood of developing mental illness. Not everyone who has these risk factors will develop a mental health problem, but the more risk factors that are present, the more likely that they're going to experience some problems. And we can see that lack of social connectedness and loneliness are among them, racial or sexual minority adjustment among minority populations, fear of disappointing parents by their grades or their career path choices could be a piece of this. Lack of physical activity or sleep, excessive substance use is prevalent among our college students. Also, if they experience negative life events like interpersonal violence, relationship loss, sexual assault, legal issues, illnesses. And in addition, there are other stressors they might experience like academic, financial, or relational that we see in our college students that we can address. And then if they had a pre-existing mental illness among themselves or family members, that is a risk factor as well. Something that I've heard about architecture programs in particular that might come up are these performance comparisons or workload pressure. So comparing one's work to others, or some of the workload pressure in that academic environment that is part of the curriculum and the culture in these programs. So we'll hear about that in the later talks. In addition to risk factors, we look for warning signs, and these are more factors that are indicators of imminent risk that somebody is experiencing a mental health problem. So not only do we need to understand risk factors, we need to understand the warning signs. And part of our prevention programs is training students, faculty, and staff to recognize these signs so that they can refer students to the appropriate services. So they will want to look for changes in behavior, like reduced participation activities, isolation, changes in eating and sleeping, not being as productive, again, substance use, impaired judgment, changes in appearance, changes in mood, like that sadness, agitation, hopelessness, and changes in what they say, like saying I'm totally worthless, I'm messing up everything in my life, I'm such a failure, I've let people down. Also complaining about physical sensations in their body or physical problems can be part of mental health. We don't always recognize that that's one piece of it or one indicator that people may discuss, and if they feel uncomfortable labeling a mood change. On the flip side, we also need to understand the protective factors. So the factors that buffer or mitigate the potential risk that a person can experience for related to mental health. And in college students, we can see that increased resiliency or the ability to bounce back after difficult, stressful, or traumatic events, social connectedness, something we can certainly bolster on college campuses, that sense of community and connectedness. That's a lot of what we do with our suicide prevention work, because that is a huge risk/protective factor, and sense of belongingness, optimism, mindfulness, that a capability of being taking a non-judgmental awareness to present moment experiences, self-compassion, so capacity to forgive and encourage and motivate oneself when you're struggling with feelings of personal failure. There's self-compassion training programs that it can increase that, and physical activity as well. We are always thinking about physical and social fitness, and those complement each other. It's very hard to read this slide, but I'm just going to tell you what's on here. These are the data from our National College Health Assessment that we collect on our campus, and also we can compare them to national averages. So I'll be looking at that over the next few slides. But what you can see are the factors that are most likely to negatively impact academic performance among all students. And the top concerns among students are mental health concerns. So that on the left is anxiety, followed by depression, and the highest bars, the tallest ones on there are for stress, which is between 35 to 40%. We're reporting high levels of stress. They also report high levels of sleep difficulties interfering with performance. I hear that is also a factor in the architecture programs as well. So that may be relevant and salient there. You can see the data, the orange data are pre-COVID, the gray bars are post-COVID. And so you can see that there are some slight increases in anxiety and depression post-COVID. And despite this, only about a third of our students are accessing psychological services in the past 12 months. These are more data from the National College Health Assessment, and this is the non-specific psychological distress scale that looks at anxiety and depression symptoms broadly assessed. And you can see on the left-hand side, it breaks it down by no, distress, moderate, and serious. And Clemson students are the orange bar at Clemson 2020. And then the green bar is national averages 2020. And then the gray bar is the Clemson 2022. So what we can see is Clemson students actually were faring better than the national averages in terms of their distress levels. But looking at the gray bar, you can see that it did increase in the moderate and serious psychological distress areas post-COVID. The right-hand side, we can see the overall mean on the scale, again, with similar trends. And finally, we have some data on resilience in orange bar showing Clemson pre-COVID, gray post-COVID, and green is the national average pre-COVID. And we don't have the post-COVID data yet for national, but we can see that Clemson students have higher resilience scores, which is a good thing. We have some protective factors in place is what that's showing us, and perhaps are equipping our students to address mental health problems in comparison to national averages. And resilience stayed similar pre and post COVID among our students. Again, that's their ability to kind of bounce back or recover after difficult, stressful, traumatic events. And the overall stress experiences within the last 30 days, we can see that Clemson students were similar to national averages on that, with over 50% reporting moderate stress and about 25% reporting high stress. So that's concerning that the majority of students are reporting moderate to high stress in the last 30 days. And we've seen slight increases post-COVID in those levels. So again, that's something that's an indicator that this is a problem in our students that we need to address. And maybe historically we thought that colleges and universities, hey, that's not that's not our role. That's, stay in your lane. But over time that we have been considering what is the role of universities in addressing well-being among our students. And there has been a movement towards engaging with more health promotion and wellness initiatives on our campuses to enable our students to have control over and improve their health. And that is what is recommended by World Health Organization, American College Health Association, is that we should have this positive proactive approach and move beyond a focus on just the individual, but look at social and environmental interventions. And guess what? That's what our college communities are, is social environmental places and communities that engender a culture that can promote health, physical and mental health and well-being. And so we do have a duty to help our members develop the skills to optimize their well-being, establish environments where health and well-being are recognized as critical components of students' ability to learn, work, enjoy, and contribute to the community. And the key is really moving beyond our traditional approaches that focus on individual behavior, but upstream to systems level approaches and environmental strategies that influence health and well-being of person, place, and planet. So that is, those are some of the guidelines that we're considering as overarching aspirational goals. This is, again, hard to read, but I'll explain this model. So one way of taking a systems level approach is basing our approaches on what's called the socio-ecological model for public health and mental health promotion. And you can just see that's a multi-layered, multifaceted approach. And at the middle ring there is the individual level, where we're looking at individual factors. And maybe that's traditionally where we wanted to focus on giving people coping skills and how to address stress and mindfulness training and adaptability. But we also can think about the next level up, which is relationships, how to promote healthy relationships among family, peers, and also we would think about our academic community, staff and faculty who are relating to our students. And then there's the organizational level, where we want to look at other educational interventions, partnerships with the community, service organizations, and student organizations on campus. And then community level, we can look even outside of that. We have partnerships with our businesses in our community to reduce alcohol use, for example. And we want to have a health promoting climate of safety and well-being in the larger community in which our campus is embedded. There's also the policy level, where we need to have policies in place that promote health. And that could be government regulations, it could be university regulations and policies, student codes of conduct, et cetera, that we put in place to help link our students to services and ensure a safe environment and a health promoting environment. And then the societal level is the last kind of layer to consider, like reducing stigma towards mental health treatment seeking would be one example of a societal cultural change that we could work on. And we have various strategies and interventions to try to change our climate about mental health in society too. So campuses are doing things like recognizing students for resilience skills, creating living learning communities where there are students that want to focus on mindfulness and stress management in those communities, embedding their mental and emotional wellness programs in their curricular offerings or co-curricular offerings. There are just a host of different strategies that can cut across these different levels. We also want to think about the continuum on which these strategies fall. Where I've been talking a lot about prevention, which is a big focus of, we have a whole actual department on Clemson campus that is called Healthy Campus, and it's all about health promotion and prevention. But we can look all the way across the continuum to treatment and recovery as well. So depending on where students at in terms of their level of risk, we may engage them in prevention programs versus they may need higher levels of care, such as treatment that we have at our health center. So there's prevention strategies that are universal that target the entire population that we might want to expose all our campus community to those risk factors and warning signs and understanding how to promote their mental health. And there's selective interventions that target those who are at risk. So if we go back to that slide on risk factors and and really hone in on those particular students and deliver more intensive kind of interventions or tailored interventions for those populations, we can do that. Like we have educational outreach initiatives for eating disorders or substance use or people exposed to interpersonal violence. And then there's indicated interventions for those who are already experiencing mental health problems. So to end with, I just was going to talk a little bit about what we have on our campus in terms of prevention. We have an Aspire to Be Well program that all incoming students receive, a Campus Well app and newsletter, Be Well activities and events calendar that lists events and activities that they can participate in. Mindfulness classes are provided. And there's also a lot of outreach and education programs and training that our Healthy Campus provides that you can have, like, for example, there's a Don't Cancel That Class initiative where a professor can have someone talk to their class about any number of topics like stress management or suicide prevention. And that can reach across various departments in the university. We have resources for specific populations like families and international students. And like I said, there's partnerships with the city and businesses. And part of what we do is try to train advocates across our campus community and how to identify students at risk and increase their help-seeking behavior, knowledge of resources, and help facilitate access to care among our students, as well as promote social connectedness and communicate with the experts. Sometimes we work on trying to figure out who are the, we want to train everybody in these skills, but sometimes you want to identify who are going to be your champions or your key stakeholders who can be a visible person that in people's departments or units that they can go to and they know they're knowledgeable and can link them with the right skills and resources. And finally, we do have some on the other end of the continuum. Of course, we have interventions. The key is having evidence-based interventions. Usually that's a cognitive behavioral approach is what we call it, changing thoughts and behaviors to work on addressing these problems. But there's a lot of different services that are offered by our counseling and psychological services like therapy assistance online, which provides us greater access to people who, where we don't have enough clinicians to give everyone one-on-one intensive therapy, then we can provide more students with services that way. And some of them are more amenable to that kind of treatment. And we have lots of groups offered for different topics and populations and specialty clinics, workshops, online mental health screening, and mindfulness classes. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of campus and community outreach on mental health topics. So the next steps in terms of this field of campus health promotion are evaluating the efficacy of these prevention and intervention programs and knowing what works best so that we can then disseminate that across various campuses. But we also need to know how to tailor for different target audiences, communities, and cultures, such as architecture programs, and the other speakers will talk a little bit about that. And we need to think about the continuum of care from prevention to recovery, and how do we link students across that entire continuum, make sure that there's follow-up and that no one is lost through the cracks. And as I said earlier, we need to disseminate our interventions broadly, make sure we train our entire community on these skills while also enlisting champions and key stakeholders to help sustain these efforts and make them more visible on our campuses. So that concludes my piece of this, and I think we'll move on. Okay.
So next, we're going to hear from Sally and Matt. And I might have failed to tell you kind of the format of what we're going to do today. So we're going to hear about 15 minutes from each of the groups. So we're going to hear from professors in architecture and landscape, and then the students, which with no disrespect to the faculty, it's the best part, because hearing from the students, it's kind of like the firsthand point of view. And then, so after that, we will have plenty of time to really engage in thinking about strategies, right? So a lot of this really talks about the problems, the national problem, the regional, the problem we're having at Clemson. And the second part will focus on strategies, what we've been doing at Clemson, and then maybe hearing from you on what things that are best practices that you seem to be discovering that might work as well, and maybe ways to collaborate.
Thanks, Dina. So as you can see, I primarily work with our undergraduate students in architecture at Clemson. especially the ones that are just beginning their studies in architecture. And I see a lot of these problems every year, which is what led to me being involved in this topic. So I'm going to really give some background information about the history of learning and teaching culture in architecture schools. I'm also going to talk a little bit about what design studio is, because some of you may not know. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the hidden curriculum and the challenges with solutions. Once I get finished, Matt's going to talk about some of the surveys and research that we've done with our freshman students at Clemson. So mental health in architecture schools has been a problem for quite some time. The AIAS just released a report on this in 2020. And basically this has been a problem that we have known about since the 1990s. And so it's something that has been persistent. And I'm going to show you some of the research that they had in this publication. Okay, so some of the history of learning and teaching culture in architecture. So this first was reported on in 2000 by the AIAS Studio Culture Task Force. That was a task force that was created because of the unhealthy culture in architecture schools, and it was really led by students. Second, in 2002, the AIAS wrote, "Change is needed to produce healthier, more optimistic, and more engaging architecture school graduates." So this is not a new topic. It's one that I think is just because of the things that Heidi was talking about. We're just starting to see that it's getting worse, even though it's been around for a while. We have had continuous improvements, such as NAB, which is our accrediting agency, has started to require students to have, or schools to have, a studio culture policy, as many of you know if you teach in architecture schools. And then finally, the latest publication came out after the Learning and Teaching Culture Policy Project, which actually gave schools sort of model things to implement so that they could actually start to address the problem in a better way. And like I said, this is something that has been led by students. They are leading the conversation, and they are leading really the change that is needed. But you can see we have a long ways to go. So some of the results from this document that they published in 2020, so they had a really great responses to this to this topic. They had over 70% of faculty respondents teach at least one studio class. And then they also had over 70% of students respond that had had more than 2 years of architecture school, which means that they've been in architecture school and they sort of know what's going on. So this really was a great sort of sample. The next thing that I think is really interesting from this is that over 90% of the students in architecture school know what a learning and teacher culture policy is, but I think it's less than, I can't read my slide right now, but less than 70% say that it's not really, no, less than 50% of students say that it's not really talked about. So while everyone's aware of it, it's not really a big part of the classroom and of the studio. In terms of professors, so over 80% of faculty are aware of the studio culture policies, but almost 50% say that the policy is not referenced frequently. So while we have these, and they are a part of all architecture schools that have accreditation, they are not really an integral part of the studio and the teaching and learning culture. In terms of the lifestyles, only 50% of students feel that their existing studio culture outlines a positive lifestyle, whereas faculty think, or 71% of faculty think that it does. And so what this means is there's really a disconnect between what is healthy versus what we think might be healthy. And there's a difference between expectations of students and the expectations of faculty. And so this is something that we need to start to discuss and come together on. Finally, this is one of the things, because this has been worked on now for over 20 years. Over 46% of students say that they spend more than 40 hours a week on studio. And that number has actually gone up significantly over the past 5 years. And so the problem, it seems, is not necessarily getting better. It actually is getting worse. And then another factor, and I know that this was mentioned earlier, but some of our students, they're showing, unhealthy lifestyles. So for instance, over 80% of students report that they have missed meals due to work in studio. So we all know that if you don't eat and sleep and have a healthy habits, that promote your health and wellness, you're not going to be healthy. And so these are some things that I think are very important for us to know. So the AIS survey results, these are some of the top struggles, and these do align with some of the things that Heidi mentioned earlier. So these were the things that students reported as more than 5% of students reported are issues that they struggle with. So first, they really struggle with financial burden of school. They struggle with lack of sleep. They struggle with the frequently unprepared for reviews and critiques. So maybe they're not given enough time to prepare for those events. They lack the necessary skills that they think they need to be successful. And then they have too much time spent out of studio. That one's kind of an outlier, I think. Top issues that faculty struggle with while teaching in architecture school. The number one is work-life balance. So obviously we are not doing very well in terms of, modeling a healthy lifestyle if faculty are saying that this is the thing that they struggle with the most. Faculty also report a lack of necessary resources and disappointment with students. So what does Design Studio look like for those of you that might not be familiar with it? First of all, it is all project-based. Most studios do not have tests or sort of exams in your typical type of classroom setting. It is all project-based, so a project is given and students work on that project throughout the semester. Second, it is performance-oriented instead of learning-oriented. So what that means is a student goes through the studio in a learning process, but at the very end, it's really about putting your work on the wall and showing everyone what you have done. So it's really about that performance. The classes are very long. The classes meet about 3 times a week for 4 hours each. And that's just a very long time to sit in a chair being productive. And that can lead to these problems as well. It is a very collaborative space, which sometimes for some students, that's a great thing, but for other students, it actually does create some anxiety being in a room with lots of people and having to work with each other. We all know that's also can be difficult at times to collaborate in a meaningful way. It is creative. It can be competitive. So for instance, when everyone puts their work up at the end of the day, or when everyone shows their work during studio hours, even if a professor isn't creating that competition, students do have a sense of competition because they're seeing everyone else's work and they're constantly judging themselves against that. There are no right answers. I find this to be one of the struggles of my freshmen. So, there's not an answer to the problem. There are lots of answers. Some answers might happen to be better, but that can cause a lot of stress as well for students. And then finally, the assessments may seem subjective. So, with a math problem, there's always an answer, but with an architecture problem, there's not. And it can be difficult to know how you're going to be graded and assessed with that work. So the final thing I'm going to talk about is the hidden curriculum. So the hidden curriculum refers to implicit values and norms that learners experience through the culture of educational institutions. Some of the ones that we have in architecture are the following. So the hierarchical and the social relationships. So for instance, professors, TAs, there's really a hierarchy. In firms, there's a hierarchy that is sort of similar to what we have in school. We can thwart dialogue sometimes. So there might be an idea, professor may have an idea for what great design is. And if a student does not agree with that, it can create some problems. There are what is considered acceptable knowledge in our field. Again, this kind of is a power balance. We focus on products rather than the process of getting there. And then the apprenticeship model leads to type and increased competition. So what this means is that if you have a professor and they have a certain type of design that they like. In some ways, you're sort of encouraged to go with that route, which can cause problems. And some of the reasons that we have this hidden curriculum is first, the history and the tradition of pedagogical practice. So architecture has been around for a while, the study of architecture has been around for a while, and we feel like there are certain ways to do this. We also have perfectionism. So a lot of students that study architects are self-described perfectionists. A lot of us are as well. It can be a combative culture around the performance of the studio review. And I'm sure all of us, if you are in architecture schools or landscape architecture school, you've probably seen some of those studio reviews where they can get combative. And then finally, the complex relationship between education and practice. So now Matt is going to talk about the survey that we did with our freshmen.
Great job. Thank you, Sally. My name is Dr. Matt Powers, and I'm the Director of Landscape Architecture at Clemson University. And I'm going to share with you some results from several studies that Sally and I have done. We've conducted quite a few studies. We teach first year beginning design together at Clemson. And these are the two that I'm going to share with you today are some surveys that we conducted last year with students in architecture, landscape architecture, and some of the minor students in architecture. It was a class every Friday. We get together and we have a joint seminar. And during that seminar, we'll talk about architecture, landscape architecture. And we used to do that for 15 weeks, the length of the semester. But at some point, we started recognizing some of these issues even before we had the data to support it. And we started to substitute some of the content on architecture and landscape architecture with study sessions, with sessions on suicide prevention and others. And so some of this information that we'll present today is within that context. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are surveys, and then we're going to talk about concept mapping. So to present this information, because as you could tell, we've got over 100 students who responded to the surveys with open-ended data, we're going to use word clouds as a way of showing you the major themes. Also, they're visual and fun, and they're clouds, so that's kind of cool. Even though I pulled the cloud out of here, you'll have to use your imagination. So the main things here that you can see when you look at one of these diagrams are that the larger words are the major themes. Those things that were said the most by the 100+ students. These are all first year students in architecture and landscape architecture. So we asked them some questions. The first question is, what excites you the most about coming to Clemson? And there's not a lot to conclude here. It's kind of a little bit of what you would expect. They're really interested in architecture. They're interested in their major. They're interested in meeting new people. The things that you'll see as you go along are the importance of relationships, the importance of time, the importance of the major. And as you follow along, I challenge you to see if you see anything different. But these are some of the main things that we'll see as we go along through these. Keep in mind that this was given out to students when they had only been on campus for a week. So it was the first day. So we're calling this pre-instruction. So it's before we did any of those seminars that I mentioned. So this is what they're expecting and what they're thinking. So this is what makes them nervous: the classes, time management, meeting new people, which also is what excites them. So again, you see relationships, you see time, you see the work, you see the workload. Some of this is based off probably high school and things that they were told by their guidance counselors, their parents, maybe friends that they've had in college, brothers or sisters, about what to expect. It's very kind of general, I would say. The challenge that they'll face, and here we're asking them specifically about their health and wellness. Again, we see work, we see time management, stress, a lot of the things that you would sort of expect. Although if you really look at these word clouds up to here, you'll notice again that they're very generalized. They're not too specific on any one thing, or something like, doesn't necessarily say design critique or review. Those things are not showing up. Keeping up with my sketchbook or something like that. They're still very general, which you would expect with students who are just new to the school. What you see, and generally seeing those, are that students are excited about coming. They really want to learn about architecture and landscape architecture and design. They're excited to meet new people, but they're also very nervous. And the thing that they're nervous about is falling behind and getting their work done. Now, what we're going to show you is something a little bit different. These are some concept maps. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we get to concept maps, we have upper level students. So the upper level students are students in 3rd and 4th year. And these students have been around a little bit longer. So what you should see here as we look at these are the same kinds of trends and the same kinds of themes, which is work and relationships, but you might see some more architecture, landscape architecture, studio specific things one would expect. For example, here you see projects, which you didn't see in the previous word clouds. You also see professors. One of the biggest stressors are professors. And that shouldn't be so surprising when we think about what Sally presented with regards from the AIAS. Another question we asked the upper level students were, what do you wish you could change about school? Yeah, here professors is a little bit bigger. Time, class, they really wish they could change. Wishing is a big deal, I guess. Work, students. But again, if you step back and you look at these, it's the same themes as before. It's really about relationships, individuals, people, groups, and it's about time and work. It's just a little bit more specific. Resources. So now we're asking, what can we do to help? And this is going to be kind of a preview or foreshadowing of what we're going to talk about later and the things that we've actually tried to do here at our school. So they talk again about students and help with their time. They just need general help. But I think time is starting to emerge as a major factor. I don't know if you can tell, but that's what it looks like to me. What could the school do again to support? Here we're asking specifically about health and wellness. And we see things like breaks. Here we see breaks. And just again, as some foreshadowing, one of the things we did in my studio was take a 15-minute break in the middle of studio, just to give them a time. So we all tried some different things, not because we just wanted to, but because the data sort of suggested it. So that's where we're going with these. So again, time, interpersonal relationship, work expectations are important. After looking through several hundred of these are a few that I thought really encapsulated some of those themes. I feel like we do so much work, it's barely time to learn what you actually did. That's about time, that's about the pacing, that's about the workload. Feeling exhausted from working on projects during most of my free time. That's very stressful when you take the free time that you should be spending, and you know you should be spending exercising with friends, and you're dedicating it to what you consider work. Also, just as a quick aside, learning here and work are synonymous. You know, often we think of work, we think about it as different from play. And I think there's some interesting connections between those. Being understanding of students' obligations outside of the classroom. This may be why the word professors was big earlier as one of the major stressors. Sometimes we get a sort of myopic view on our projects and what we're doing, and there's a lot of demands associated with those, and we push those pretty hard, and we often aren't as understanding as we need to be. The best resource within my major are my peers. That's back to the interpersonal relationships, really shows the value of peers, not just from a learning perspective, but also from a support perspective. The fact that we get punished as paying students for doing bad when life hits you. And so I think that's a recognition that I'm paying a lot of money to come to college. You could actually lay the cost of college as an overlay over this as well, in addition to many other stressors. And that to be punished on top of it when I have to go to work or I'm in ROTC or for my extracurricular activities makes things doubly hard. Now we are going to talk about the concept maps. I'll go through these pretty quick. Concept mapping is something that Sally and I have used as a data collection and analysis tool for a few years now. We've presented quite a bit on it. A concept map simply is a map of what's in your mind. Some people call it a knowledge map. You give people a piece of paper, they put a word in the middle of a concept. Like today, we could put the word health, and then you would draw a map about everything you know about that. If you do it before instruction and you do it after instruction, you almost always see a big change between the first one and the second one, because your knowledge and your knowledge and understanding has increased, and it then is represented on that map. We're not going to see that on these, and that's why I wanted to present them. They're a little bit small and sort of hard to see, but what we did here is we took the first year students in landscape architecture, and on the left, you see the pre-instruction, the map from the very first day, the same day they did the surveys. And on the right, you see the end of the semester. And quickly, when you look at this, I'm sure Sally would agree, we've looked at so many of these maps. There should be on the right one a lot more information because we provided them with more information. So you don't really see the growth that we see when we study things like metacognition or learning or just a lot of the other stuff that we've studied. But what you do see is really important. And if we look at, I have 3 examples here, a little bit of growth on the one on the right, Sometimes there's not a lot of growth, but the way that they connect them with those lines shows a stronger understanding of the concept and how different words and ideas interrelate. So you see a little bit of that there, and you see a little bit of it here, but not too much. But what you do see, if you really look at them closely, are you see a lot of the protective factors that Heidi was talking about. And Sally also said something when she was talking about time management, getting enough sleep, and we all know that's important. You do see that in these. They coming out of high school, whether it's from their high school or their parents or wherever they're getting their resources, they have a lot of information coming into the School of Architecture with regards of what you probably should be doing to stay healthy and to be well. But what you don't see is the application of that to the very unique nature of the design studio and studio culture, as Sally described it. And there's really no substitute for that. And we told them about that, but it doesn't really take effect until you've been in the studio and you're up there late at night and your professor doesn't give you the, the support that you think you might want, or your friends are challenging you. It gets very competitive. There's really no way to explain that. And I think that's really the take home here, is that the students are prepared, but they're not prepared for the unique aspects of it. And that's why having strategies and things that are very, very specific can make a difference. So they have a generalized concept, but not a real specific understanding and strategies that they can use to maintain the health and wellness. And I think, just in conclusion, knowing that you should be healthy and what it takes, but not being able to do that creates a major stressor in itself. Thank you.
Okay, Catherine and I are going to probably bounce around a little bit here to help each other out. But so I want to thank the previous presentations for really putting everything in perspective here. So Catherine and I will try to continue that. And so in this presentation, we will explore the negative effects of design education on student mental health and wellness. And this presentation was really made possible by our research team. I'm Michael Urueta, and again, this is Catherine Price, and we'll be presenting our research today. With us, we also have Luke and Julia on stage, and then not mentioned here, but I would like to mention now, Laura Browning, also a faculty in landscape architecture, helped with the research as well. So architecture students are expected to spend at minimum 24 to 30 hours per week working on studio projects. But since 2015, studio expectations demand that students spend approximately 10 additional hours per week. The School of Architecture at Clemson University comprises both landscape architecture and architecture programs, both of which have grown significantly over the past few years. The students in Dr. Battisto's ARC 8210 Research Methods course, along with the Student Health and Wellness Task Force, collaborated to administer an online health and wellness survey, the DAS-21 assessment, as well as conduct one-on-one interviews with our architecture and landscape architecture students. The objectives of this case study were to measure students' emotional states of depression, anxiety, and stress, understand the health and well-being of students and their stressors, and to gather student feedback to better understand their mental health and well-being. So the DAS-21 stands for Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale. This instrument is used to measure these 3 negative emotional states using 21 questions and a self-reporting scale to answer each. Next is the Wellness Evaluation Survey, which was administered to students to identify the cause and effects of stress and students' own remedies to these. And finally, a qualitative inquiry was conducted in the form of one-on-one interviews. The goal of the interviews was to gain insight on the triggers of stress and anxiety among architecture and landscape architecture students.
So we'll begin with the DAS-21 assessment on stress. In both architecture and landscape architecture, graduate students screened for higher levels of stress. In fact, experience of extreme stress was 20% for graduate architecture students and 25% for graduate landscape architecture students. In both undergraduate and graduate levels, architecture and landscape architecture students have similar anxiety levels. 1/3 of all students assessed have severe to extreme anxiety. Undergraduate architecture and landscape architecture students are screening for higher rates of severe depression than graduate architecture and landscape architecture students. Moving on to the survey. The highest stressors for all School of Architecture students are school deadlines and scheduling, workload demands, and getting an inadequate amount of sleep. The majority of architecture and landscape architecture students reported that workload demands and amount of work are major contributors to both stress and anxiety. Over half of the students within the Clemson School of Architecture have poor sleeping patterns and have trouble focusing when stressed. You got it. Landscape architecture students have more difficulties focusing when stressed, whereas architecture students are less physically active and practice poor eating habits due to stress. The top strategies that students in the School of Architecture use to relieve stress are spending time with friends and family and socializing, sleeping, and enjoying a favorite hobby. Between architecture and landscape architecture students prefer spending time outdoors, no surprise there, partaking in spiritual practices or meditation, and taking medication to lower stress and promote wellness. So moving on to the interviews, the transcriptions from the interviews were grouped into 5 main themes, which are workload and time, communication, personal and self-care, program and culture, and social relationships. These and the findings from the DAS-21 and wellness survey help to inform strategies employed in the spring and in the fall of 2022. Thank you.
Okay, great. So now we're gonna try to start a discussion, and I'm gonna put the two here on the end, on the spot at the end, because they're not in architecture, and I'm curious to know your point of view, because you're not in architecture, right? So Luke on the end is in psychology, Julia is in nutrition, and I'm as I listened to the presentation, I thought, geez, is workload demands and scheduling and coordination, are those the same issues that are faced, do you think, by the undergrad students or by different disciplines? And even Heidi, who represents psychology, is this kind of across all disciplines, or is this specific to architecture and landscape architecture and the design fields? So with that, we're going to just start with that discussion a little bit, and then we're going to try to focus on some strategies. So maybe you guys can start. I mean, is that workload? I mean,
yeah, I can start.
we've been reading a lot of statistics and numbers. So now let's talk from the heart a little bit and kind of hear what you have,
Yeah, so
you're-
from prior to my exposure to the architecture department, I had no idea what design studio consisted of or comprised of. Being in psychology department and in other, I guess, academic didactic worlds, we have tests, quizzes, assignments, projects, papers, etc. We do not have that additional 30-hour workload of design studio each week. I would say my experience in the world of school right now already consists of 40 hours of school minimum. That's either attending classes or doing work. That I could not imagine adding an additional 30-hour piece of chunk of my time to an assignment like a project each semester. So that's definitely not my experience in the architecture department. or in my department as compared to the architecture department. So I don't know if Julia has any different experiences in nutrition.
I mean, I would say exactly as if it was in psychology. In addition, I have my classes in our academic building. I'm able to go to class and then I'll do my homework outside. I'll go socialize in the library. I'll socialize in other buildings with other majors as well. It's not, okay, I have an office, my own office in the nutrition department. It's a lot of social interaction that I get through working with those 40 hours. So there's a lot of isolation that comes from architecture that isn't prevalent in other majors.
So maybe, thank you. With that, I'd like to hear now your personal point of view as students. Is all the statistics kind of, do you feel that? I know that you would come in with lots of red eyes. So you average 4 hours of sleep a night, he'd say. So just to share a little bit about the real experience.
Okay. Well, I think Luke and Julia made a pretty good point that, you know, there is this addition that architecture students have, but I don't know if it, I would say it's probably because of the project based, you know, graded and like assignments. It's not an exam or a quiz that you take and then there is like a right answer, right? You either get it right or wrong. With projects, there's multiple right answers, which was discussed earlier. And so I think there is this, you know, kind of, it eats away at you, even if you think you have the right answer. You know, I personally have sat up all night having a project done, but wanting to make it better because I know that there's something better than I have currently. Even if that might not be the case, it still is because there's no right answer. So I think that has been my personal experience, is just feeling like it can always be better and that a project's never done. And that's something that's preached by our professors, is that a project is never done. And I think that unintentionally at times eats away at people like me personally that are very, I would say, type A and want to always do the best and do my best. And so that means maybe no sleep because I feel like I can get that much better of a project, when in reality, it probably winds up becoming worse because I have no sleep. So that's my personal experience.
Yeah,
Kat, how do you feel?
I think for me personally, there's also an underlying sense of competition with your peers. And so even if your project is finished and you believe that it's right and you've had encouragement from your professors that it's a good project, there's somebody else in the class who has this really amazing project and you feel like, gosh, I want to get mine to be at the level of greatness that theirs is. And then there was something else. I've had discussions with peers in other majors about staying up all night, studying for a test for the next day. And I've always discouraged it, and I've always been discouraged to do that because at some point you're not retaining any more information than you had originally, and you're not going to perform as well. But with a project, even if you're not doing everything perfectly well, you're at least advancing it to some degree. And so staying up all night is often our choice when we want to finish a project the next day.
Very good. That's great. So now what I'd like to do is kind of switch to strategies. Like, how do we make it better? You know, we've heard a lot of different things. Did you have, and you were raising your, no, you're okay. 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 So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we've been working on, because we clearly measured the problem, we highlighted the problem, and we did the research in the fall, and in the spring, which is this last semester, we had a student health and wellness seminar, and we started trying things, just like Matt and Sally tried things. And I'll tell you just a couple things that we tried with our group, and then you can come up and share. And then we'd like to also hear what maybe you have shared, what you've tried. So one thing that I can say that I've learned is that what might appeal to one student is not going to appeal to another student. What will work for one student, and maybe as a clinical psychologist, we're all different, right? Every person that comes in is different. So the protective factors have to be customized around the individual's ask what they're capable of doing or their personalities. So some of the things that we did, is, well, we started in the fall with introducing walks in the botanical garden as a way to just kind of take a break and relax. And Kat here came to every single one of them. And what was beautiful was at some point in the semester when I said, let's go for a walk, I didn't realize the kind of the other benefit of the walk would be that I got to know the students at a whole different level. I got to understand the students. I got to know the students. And that allowed me as a teacher, as an educator, to teach better to the students. So we did the walks. We did a trivia night, which was great. That was, you know, these students following COVID were just really hungry for a sense of belonging and socialization and a community. And trivia night was definitely a hit. We also did craft night where they painted pots, and that was another wonderful way to get together. And then the one that I personally thought was going to be great was not so well received. I did what's called, what do we call it? Mindful movement. And I thought this would be great because everybody's ramped up. They haven't had sleep. Let's calm them down. Let's breathe. The research talks about, you know, the neurological benefits of circular movements. And I mean, I thought it was going to be great, but nobody came. And I'm not sure if it was because the end of the semester and everybody was too busy. I mean, they can't even take a break for a meal. So I can't blame them for wanting to go and take an hour of movement and relaxation. We also tried kind of social gatherings. We'd have happy hours. But the thing is that, you know, I don't know what the solution is. I know that we also at the end of the semester had a really big kind of party, you know, and that was really fun too as a retirement for one of the professors. So, you know, I know that, and I want to let you guys come up here and talk a little bit about what you guys have done. And then maybe hear a little bit more about, you know, what we've done that works, and then maybe hear from you all and ask questions about, I mean, how do we break the stress cycle? You know, I mean, I was just thinking, I'm not sure if the workload has gone up. Maybe it has, but when I was in architecture school, it was pretty high too. I don't know if it's the students don't have the protective factors. I don't know if there's increasing competition. I don't know if we're just more fragile. I don't know if it's because of the worldly problems that are on the shoulders of the students today that are making them just feel like a tremendous sense of burden. But I do know this. It's funny because since I've started to become a point person on student health and wellness, I get all kinds of emails every time something kind of flashes over New York Times and talks about students are unwell. But what do we do to change it? How do we make it better? So Matt and Sally, one of you want to talk a little bit about, I know you've been doing some things. Yeah, we got that. Maybe we'll bring this microphone over there. About your mental health break days and things like that. Or what have you discovered that seems to be working?
So Matt and I have done some things together, but we've also done some things separately. So in the architecture portion, a couple of the things that we have started. So a year ago, we started a mentor program where every freshman is matched up with an upperclassman in either an undergraduate upperclassman or a graduate student. The students meet with their mentors 4 times during the semester for an hour during studio class. So class time from studio is actually given so they can do that. The other thing that I think is interesting about that project is that students get to self-select their mentor. So I don't match them up. They get to pick who they want to be with. So that's the first thing that we did, just to try to create a community, also someone else that they can just reach out to. The second thing that we did was I introduced 2 mental health days during the semester. The students loved the mental health days because it gave them that extra flexibility just to take time off if they needed it. And I loved it because it told me when I had a student who was struggling, which meant that I could reach out to them and say, hey, do you have support? And if not, let me help you get support. So that is something that I, without a doubt, will continue just because it helped me know who was having problems. Earlier, students would just miss class and they'd be counted absent. And I wouldn't know if it was due to something they were struggling with or if they just didn't want to get up that morning. Another thing that we did in the architecture freshman class is I actually cut the work in half. This year, I had done a survey to find out how much time students were spending on work, and the hours were just too much. Like if you just do the math of the number of hours they're in class, the number of hours they were working out of class, just too much. So I went through and every assignment just cut it in half. And I thought that it would obviously affect quality, but it did not. I was just very open and transparent to the students. And I was like, look, this is too much, or I think it's too much, but we still have to get to where we need to get to by the end of the semester. So we're going to focus on quality and not quantity. And it went great. So that is something that I think we will continue to do, and to make sure that students aren't spending too much time and that it is a realistic amount of work. The other thing that Matt and I did together is that on the Fridays, instead of just talking about architecture and stuff, we talk about other things. So we do suicide prevention training each semester. We do an intro to the Academic Success Center each semester. We have the Healthy Campus folks come and talk to our students about all the programs that they offer. And so we've really tried to start having some instruction on these things that are, that deal with health and wellness.
Also, on the Fridays in the past, we've had graduate students come and we've done mock pinups with them, like pretend pinups. And sometimes we would be kind of hard on them and sometimes we wouldn't. And then the students would share, the graduate students would share with the undergrads how it felt, how you could react, basically kind of managing your feelings in relative to the pinup and the professor and the other people in the class. So just to kind of help them get prepared for what to expect and how to feel during these very competitive times sometimes. So we've done a lot of different things. We've also done design learning, where we've talked to them about, keeping a sketchbook and setting goals and what design learning is and how learning design is different from learning other subjects. And that's been, I think, helpful. Sally said another thing. She said quality instead of quantity. Sometimes we've said caring instead of content, because I think it's partly our view that it's never been easier in the history of mankind to find information. It's out there. You can get books, you can get it online, you can watch YouTube videos, it's all out there. There's tons of content. And what I think people want, I think what the parents hope for with the children when they come to Clemson is caring, that somebody's out there and cares about them and is going to look out for them. And so we've kind of, I think, gone all in on that as well. And just making sure that that's something that hasn't happened in the past, but it's something that's going to happen in the future, is that it's not just about more and more content, but there's also some caring there as well. With regards to the attendance, I took a little bit different route with that. I told the students that I wasn't going to take attendance, and that if they were sick, don't come to class, please, because of COVID and other things. If you're sick, don't come to class. But if you're sad, you don't have to come to class either. Just come when you really, really want to work. And when you come, you got to give it 100%. If you're feeling okay and you think you can make it in and you're not sick, then come and give 100%. I never had attendance as high as I had last year. I mean, people came a lot. Now, other things that we did together is we had a Halloween party. We did a bunch of other things that were really fun. And I think that also counterbalanced some of the stress, and it made them also want to come to class. I think that kind of helped out as well. Sally mentioned that they had a mentoring program. We do not have a mentoring program. What we have is a coaching program. So we hire about 8 to 10 of our seniors, some of our really talented senior students, as coaches. And who they coach are the first and second year students. And what they coach are all of the different kind of soft skills and how to use the laser cutter and all the other sort of things that students can stress about that are sometimes auxiliary to the project, but just as important. And the thing that we tell them is you're not a TA, you're not a teaching assistant, you're an SA, you're a student assistant. You're there to help the students. And that has a mentoring effect. And it also gives purpose to the seniors. They feel like they're giving back. Many times they say that we shouldn't even be getting paid for this because people have helped us and now we're helping the students and giving back. And so that's been very positive. The last thing I would mention is our therapy dog program, which was really Laura Browning kind of at the center of that, I would say. Um, the therapy dog program, it got off to a slow start, partly because I and others didn't even know who to contact initially to find out how to get this thing going, because we didn't have one at Clemson. And unlike, some things, if it's about admissions, you call the admissions office, but who do you call about a therapy dog program? And so we started trying to find different people, and the university really didn't know either where we should go. And so finally they got in touch with the police, and they got in touch with all these different people. And we had a administrative assistant who actually had a therapy dog, and her friends would bring in Lexi and Cross, and I can't remember the other one's name, but they'd bring these 2 or 3 dogs. They'd bring them in on Wednesdays, and they would just walk them through for several hours through all the studios in architecture and landscape architecture. And it made a big difference. It really did. I was kind of skeptical at first. I wasn't sure how it would work out, but students came up to me and said it was the highlight of their week, that they wanted to do it more. It made a real difference. And I had a couple photos of that in our presentation as well. And during final exam, for us, review week, they came in, I think, at least maybe every single day, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, that we had the major reviews. And Laura had collected data on that, and we didn't have that today, but I think it made a real difference.
Yeah, Laura had a presentation earlier. Yeah, let's go ahead and let's open it up. How about that? Okay, Sarah, maybe we could start over here, because they shot up for your hand shot up first. So we're gonna give you a microphone.
Particularly in academics, how we are going to differentiate between the stress, what we are calling stress, and students who is using his total processing his brain for an intellectual contribution. So how we are going to differentiate between this stress and this intellectual contribution? Of course, a person or a student who is trying to bring some, going to bring some change or something, he's processing his brain. So of course, he or she might be in a different mood or in a different state. So how we are going to differentiate between these two?
I'm not sure. Yeah, that's you, Heidi. I don't know if you understood the question. Did you get the question?
Does this work?
Yeah.
Is the question differentiating between what is just a normal level of stress that's not of great concern versus when do you need to refer somebody for more care or intervention?
Yes.
Yes.
For example, if I am working hard for doing a base design in the class, of course I am working 12 hours a day than any other student who is working 2 hours a day. So of course I will be having more stressful than that other student. So how we are going to differentiate this? What in this particular case, I am not taking this as a stress, because I personally I'm working hard for something doing good. So how?
Yeah, so people interpret certain events in their lives differently, and sometimes we might perceive a stressor more as a challenge or an opportunity in a positive way, and that's not necessarily cause for concern, whereas another student might interpret that as something overwhelming that they can't cope with or handle. And so we can look at a person's response to the same stressor. It's the response that we're more interested in. And we could go back to the slide that I went over that had the warning signs. Well, both the risk factors and the warning signs. If you know it's a student that has these risk factors in place, you might want to give them extra attention and make sure that it doesn't overwhelm their coping capacity. But if you see the warning signs that changes in sleep and eating habits and hygiene and appearance, or they're not coming to class, or they're saying things like, I need to be perfect, or I'm going to be a failure, or I'm worthless, my parents are disapproving of something I'm doing, I'm worried about that. Or it just changes in their behavior, substance use or impulsive behavior, or anger, irritability. These would all be factors a person might look for. A natural helper, whether it be a student or faculty or staff, could recognize and attune to, okay, this student's at particular risk and needs a little more assistance. But at the same time, I think the strategies that all of you are talking about can address everyone's level of stress, that we could all benefit from some stress reduction in a program like architecture, where the workload is so high that it will probably tax even somebody who has a lot of resources in place. that I think all of these, that's where we get to the universal prevention programs. Why don't we try to reduce stress overall if it is something that's likely to overwhelm the majority of your students? So I don't know if that addresses your question, but really looking for those warning signs.
You know, I was going to say what's interesting is that, I mean, in our culture, we've often been taught to not show stress because it shows a sign of weakness. And I know that's true for many cultures. I think it's kind of the first time that we're starting to talk about it. And I think it's really important to start to kind of get to know students beyond the classroom a little bit, because the ones who are at risk, sometimes we don't even know. And in our DAS, the depression, anxiety, and stress scale, what was interesting, and it was kind of almost sad to read it, there's almost 10% of our students who rated, "My life has felt meaningless in the last 2 weeks." Those are the ones who are kind of at risk for suicide attempts. So, but we don't know who they are. So I think kind of reducing the stigma, starting to talk about it. I mean, it might violate a little bit of the HIPAA regulations, but if we understand, you know, the populations are at risk, then perhaps we might be able to kind of channel them in the right directions. I know for me personally, I've spent a lot more time counseling as an untrained professional than I'm teaching some days. So anyway, I think, you know, starting to talk about it is a
Right.
big
That's
thing.
what we try to train. You're doing what we
see?
train people to do, to ask the question, are you doing okay? What's going on? You know, if you notice they're missing class or a behavior change, and learning a little bit more about them, that gives them the opportunity to open up with information you need to get them help.
And that came from the students. A student suggestion was to have routine mental checks. Well, why don't we do that so that we can start to kind of identify them? Okay, who else? Let's see. Yeah.
I wanted to appreciate all of your thoughts and your presentation. I worked with Dr. Powers, and it was really, productive work, and I really learned a lot. I wanted to share my experience from Iran. I was a student there, and like architecture in my undergrad and master's in urban design. We had a lot of workload that I remembered. I stayed up all night one night to finish the project we had the other day. And like the class was as 8, and at 6:30, I was like, 30 minutes of sleep will help me to get prepared for tomorrow. And I overslept. And I missed the class and I missed the project totally. I wanted to say that our kind of method of teaching is that the studio was just about the teacher teaches the lessons and whatever and the instructions. And it was all about just showing the teacher your work, and that was it. But here I noticed that the students work in the studio. I really like that because it kind of lessens the pressure of just, putting a lot of time out of a school to do your project. I think that helps a lot. I really like this strategy. I also saw that a lot of teachers tend to see the students work at their desk, like in a regular basis and daily, and it kind of also lessens the stress that you're going to judge with your peers every session. I really like that as well. I wanted to suggest that another thing that really helps the students is visiting a lot of other places. I like the idea of the dogs. I have a sweetheart dog. If you want to add that to your collection next semester, she's such a sweetheart. Visiting a lot of projects that are relevant to students' work can also help them and to release those stresses. I have a question, is that sometimes when you put on the students' work on the wall, it is a positive competition between the students that inspires the thoughts, insights for other students. So how can we change that stressful experience of having your work on the wall to a positive, competitive, experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's how do you maintain the good and remove the bad, right? So the aspect of critiques and reviews are good because it's the dialogue. I don't know, I'll let one of those studio professors answer that. But one thing I want to mention that maybe some people don't know is studio is 6 hours. But in addition, at the graduate level, they also have 3 additional seminar courses, right? So it's compounded by the effect of having 3 additional courses. Who wants to do you? So I don't know if there's an answer to that. Go ahead.
I do have one answer. Real quickly, what I try to do is different. I actually do a lot of individual projects and not a lot of group projects because I think group projects can create a lot of stress and it's kind of a wash in terms of being efficient versus stressful. But when I do individual projects, I try to differentiate each project for each student as much as I can so that they're not doing the exact same site in the same project, because then it really becomes competitive. So I always have them, even if we have the same site, I always try to give a menu of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things they can pick from that they can add to their projects to make it a little bit different and unique. And when they're different, the competition goes down and the collaboration goes up. They're familiar with each other's project, but they're not exactly the same. And so that reduces some of the competition. I try to do that a lot in my studios.
Good. We have another question. I'm just trying to.
This one's for the students.
Yeah.
So one of the things you talk about competition, but one of the questions that I've got is what role is social media got for you in increasing your stress? Are you seeing each other's, for example, Instagram posts, and is that inspiring you or is that stressing you? Is social media helping or is it compounding the problem?
This is on, right? Yeah. So it's funny, we were kind of talking about that briefly before we came in, Catherine and I, about how we both have our own personal Instagrams, but also our architecture Instagrams. And so it's funny that I personally, and I don't spend as much time as maybe most students my age do on social media, but when I do scroll, I have nothing but architecture, and I see my friends and what they're doing, and even, other schools, like, people that I met from various conferences, then what they're doing. And I'm like, oh man, I'm not learning that. And why, or like, I haven't thought about even doing it that way. And it can be helpful because then there's that kind of sense of competition and understanding where other people are, but it can also be very stressful at times because you wonder if the way you're representing something isn't as sought after, in the professional realm as the way the other student is. And I think that can cause stress. But yeah, I think social media is maybe that one of those aspects that wasn't around, several years ago, when the workload was probably just as much, but I think there's an added stress to being able to always see what other people are doing, right? Would be my take.
I guess for me, I think I'm more intimidated when I can see in person what everybody's doing and to what degree they've gotten to. And I think that we also have a tendency to not post our projects on social media until they've gotten to a certain level. And at that point, everyone in our class is also at that level. So if it looks different, I feel like I'm more encouraging of other people's posting their projects than I am feeling intimidated by where their work is at and where mine is at, just because we want to post the best, the best that we've got, and we all do it. So,
what's interesting is one of the biggest stressors that were discovered in the survey is the lack of feeling you just don't feel valued, insecure. And it's interesting. I don't know if that's something that we're perpetuating in our architectural culture that needs to change, or it's the social media. But giving them a confidence is a protective factor, I would say. So I don't know, that we might have time for one more question. Sarah, maybe maybe two if we.
I have two, but we'll pretend it's just one. I wanted to know about how effective this cutting in half the workload was. I've taken courses where we've done similar things, and that hasn't really changed the workload because you just spend more time on one drawing or you spend more time on one essay. And then the other more general question I had was about labor advocacy. I feel like I get very depressed about becoming an architect, so much that I've decided not to become one, because it seems like a very brutal profession, where the like institutions that are supposed to protect me will not be protecting me. I'm from Ontario, so the OAA, it's like pretty terrible. And I've heard similar things about AI, yeah. So yeah, I was wondering, as like an institution, do you try to do something about that as well?
So cutting the workload in half has been great. And I probably will cut it even more this next fall, because I'd like to focus on some other things that are not based on like doing work. But I actually have seen no negative from it in any way. I did struggle with that when I first started teaching architecture, because architecture can be brutal. The education can be brutal. The practice can be brutal. I have many female friends that have left the practice because it is so brutal, but I don't think leaving is the answer. I think the answer is that we have to do better, and we have to change it, because leaving it is not an option for the world, like for me. So I'm sort of like, we need to say what we need to set our boundaries, and then that's, the profession that we need to try to create. I also think, and this is just personal, but I don't think if the profession does not change, it will not be relevant. We all know we have lots of problems in architecture. While we may have dealt with some of the diversity issues in terms of gender, we have lots of other issues that we need to address, and there's a whole lot of work to be done. And unless we address those, the profession is not going to be relevant. And for me, that change happens in the freshman year. So other than health and wellness, the other biggest thing that I focus on and that I track and that I look at are our diversity numbers. And obviously we're dealing with an uphill battle with mental health and diversity, because it's not just like this issue and that issue, they're interrelated. And if we're going to be a relevant profession, we have to be a relevant profession for everyone, and it has to work for everyone. So
let me add just one thing. I agree with all that, but just something to think about is, architects and landscape architects as professions are licensed, and we're licensed because we affect the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And we design landscapes which are restorative and healthy and meant to be places for people to enjoy. And architects do the same thing with buildings. There's a whole subset of architecture and health. And I just always find it ironic that we design these places to be healthy and healthful for other people. We drive ourselves in the ground doing it, And so to me, for professions that are so precedent driven, we need to change that precedent. And I think what Sally said about starting with first years and earlier is really important, and that we should if we're doing it for others, we should do it for ourselves as well.
I think we're out of time, but one thing I can just end on is that our team and others we've written a learning and teaching culture policy document, because it's really about culture change, right? Setting kind of the expectations, the rules in place of how to create a supportive environment. So stay tuned, and we're all up here if you guys have any questions or want to work with us, but thank you for coming. And I wanted to say thank you to everybody. I'm just excited about building the momentum here.